To all. Welcome to yet another wonderful session of lectures on world comparative literature. Our visions are constantly widening with such great talks on comparative world literature, enabling us to blur the disciplinarian boundaries that we often impose on our respective academic specialization. Comparative world literature has a canvas wide enough to include environment, philosophy, ethics, literature, sociology, and this bring varied methodologies and discourses into the ambit of comparative world literature. I express my sincere thanks to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, as without her initiative, this wouldn't have been possible. Professor Nandini Sahu, Vice Chancellor, Hindi University, West Bengal. She needs no introduction. However, she's Amazon's best-selling author, professor of English, and former director, School of Foreign Languages, IGNOU, New Delhi, India. And she's an established Indian English poet, creative writer, and folklorist. She's the author, editor of 21 books. Apart from being a double gold medalist during her graduation and post-graduation, she is the recipient of the Literary Award gold medal from the Honorable Vice President of India for her contribution to English studies. She is the recipient of the prestigious Michael Madhusudhan Academy Award 2024 and Lifetime Achievement Award 2024. Her areas of research interest cover new literatures, critical theory, folklore and cultural studies, Hindu studies, Indian knowledge system, comparative literature, children's literature, and American literature. Welcome to all. Welcome, ma'am. Our next speaker, in fact, we also have today fascinating speakers who are eminent in their respective academic zones and are consistent in contributing tremendously to insightful academic ventures. Professor Sadhana Naithani is a professor at the Center of German Studies and coordinator of Folklore Unit, JNU. She teaches modern German literature and European and Indian folklore. Her research interests include history of folklore studies, comparative folklore analysis, and world orators. She was the president of the International Society for Folk Narrative Research 2016 to 2024. Her books include The Inhuman Empire, Wildlife, Colonialism, Culture, Routledge, New York, 2024. Next book, In Quest of Indian Folktales, Indiana University Press, 2006. Next book, Folklore Theory in Post-War Germany, 2014. Folklore in Baltic History, 2019. She has also made ethnographic films on comparative German village life. Our next speaker, Professor Simi Malhotra. She is a professor in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia University. Her areas of interest include literary theory and cultural studies. Her publications include the co-authored books Terrains of Consciousness, Multilogical Perspective on Globalization, Wurzburg University Press, 2021. Next book, Ocean as a Method, Thinking with the Maritime, Routledge, 2022. And the co-edited books, Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation, and Meditation, and Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspective, and Challenges, both from Springer 2021. Her most recent and co-edited books are Globalization and Sense-Making Practices, Phenomenologies of the Global, Local, and Glocal. Next, co-edited books, Globalization and Planetary Ethics, New Terrains of Consciousness. Next, Effective World Making, Rooting Planetary Thought from Routledge. She is also the recipient of several grants and awards, the latest being the UGC DUD PPP project. We welcome you, ma'am. We welcome both the speakers. Now, I would request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, to deliver the presidential remark.
Thank you, Priyanka. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. One can be only humbled to have this kind of a panel where Professor Sadhana and Professor Simi are sitting in front of me as our invited speakers. I have been one of the greatest admirers of both of them. And I will give my remarks about their lectures once they have completed their lectures. But to begin with, I'll just take a couple of minutes to tell you about my association with both of them in the capacity of being fellow scholars in Delhi. With Professor Sadhana, I have a very long association. I was introduced to Professor Sadhana in a seminar at IGNCA by Professor Modi Kaushal, and I got to know that she is one of the most reputed folklorists, apart from being a scholar of German studies and so many areas of research that Priyanka just now pointed out. She is one of the most eminent folklorists of the world. And in that capacity, I made it a point to attend almost all her lectures whenever it was possible. She was a part of the syllabus design committee for MA folk literature that I introduced in IGNO, and she joined online, and she was kind enough to give me some material, some ideas, and to approve most of the things that I proposed. She was very, very accommodative and very kind to me and all the course material preparation team members. And Professor Sadhana has substantially contributed to world folklore. Probably without her contribution, world folklore would not have been as rich as it is today. So, Professor Sadhana, I welcome you to Hindi University as one of our eminent speakers. Your lecture is going to enrich the lecture series. And thanks a lot for having accepted our invitation in such a short notice. We deeply appreciate it. And as far as Professor Simi is concerned, I think I will take one day if I want to talk about Simi and my association with her. She is the most loved scholar in Indian academia. Everyone loves her because she is so accommodative. She is very particular and very serious about her work, and she's totally no nonsense. She does a lot of work, varieties of things she has been doing. Every time I get to hear her bio brief read by someone, something new is included, and I think, how is Simi doing so many varieties of things? And you meet her, very easy and very comfortable with everyone, very polite with youngsters, very accommodative, and she promotes people. She's a scholar of repute, and literary theory is her forte. And food culture studies is something that is very interesting, Simi has been doing. And I would rather include your books on food culture studies in our Hindi University syllabus, in our MA English or some MA course. I will talk to you about that. And also this planetary thought, it's so interesting, something very, very new. I would suggest the students and the faculty members, please take notes when Professor Simi and Professor Sadhan are speaking, because you will get new ideas. Each word they utter will be one research paper for you, so please take notes when they are speaking. Later on we can have one more discussion about those. And to Professor Simi and Professor Sadhana, let me inform a little bit about this lecture series. You both are 15th and 16th speakers, as far as I remember. We had very eminent speakers from most parts of the country. Next week, we are going to have some people from South India. We started with Professor Anishur Rahman. When I joined Hindi University, we had four departments: translation studies, then Hindi department, and then history and political science. It's a very new university, and I am the founder, vice chancellor. So we have a lot of things to do. We have to create new departments. So that is when we conceptualized something called comparative world literatures. It will be a new department or a school under which we are planning to introduce at least 30 MA courses, like 22 Indian languages, the official languages of India, and then some folk languages in the form of MA in folk literature, tribal languages in the form of MA tribal literatures, and some foreign languages like MA in German studies, where Professor Sadhana definitely would help me to design the syllabus. And six foreign languages we are planning to do. And I had a discussion with the higher authorities in the state, in the West Bengal, and they have given green signals. In near future, we are planning to launch those courses under the Department of Comparative World Literatures. And the lectures that we are doing now, they are the preliminary research, the groundwork, the homework, we can say, for that department. And when we're actually going to materialize the departments and create the new departments, I will certainly need the tangible help from both of you. That is when we will meet once again. But for today, I extend my warm welcome and complete gratitude to both of you for having accepted the invitation. We are looking forward to listening to both of you. And please, Priyanka, maybe you can invite them one by one. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I shall invite Professor Sadhana Naithani, Professor at the Center of German Studies and Coordinator of Folklore Unit JNU, to deliver her presentation. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. Thank you for giving me the word. And thank you, Professor Nandini Sahu, Madam Vice Chancellor, for this invitation to speak in this series of lectures that you have established. And I have been seeing the notices and all the wonderful scholars that are speaking there. And then you are uploading these lectures, I think, on YouTube, and therefore creating so much of knowledge database for everyone to kind of participate or to kind of learn from. So thank you very much for this invitation and for making me a part of this lecture series. Thank you also for your very kind introduction to me and my work, and to our association, which I also remember very fondly, and I hope that we'll also not be missing you in Delhi for very long. And as I said, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with my friend, and actually in some ways somebody so close and so far a situation that we are in. But very happy to be with you, Simi, once again in a session like this, and look forward to listening to you very much. It's been some time. And with that note, my greetings to all the people present here virtually. Good afternoon to you, as I'm in Delhi. My lecture today, World Literature, World Orature, and Ecological Consciousness. Now, as far as the World Orature goes, my latest publication is related to this subject. Ecological consciousness is very much part of my last book published last year, and world literature is something the creator of this concept and his work is something I'm as close to today as this, that I've done a class on it, on that author yesterday. So I'm into teaching also very closely this subject. And therefore, I would today like to make my presentation to you both as a scholar of literature and of folklore, and to see what these concepts mean to us and also to each other in many ways. Okay, so let's start with world literature. I'm sure I might be repeating some of the things that you already know, and yet for the sake of brevity, for the sake of having it here on table, some very basic facts. The concept of world literature, as far as we know, goes back to the German literary author Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he introduced this concept in several different places. So it's not like a theory of world literature, but it is an idea that he expresses in several of his personal communications to people, or his writing and his forewords, etc. And there has been a considerable amount of research in that also, as to what he might have meant and what it means today. So the time when Goethe was introducing this concept, first time when he speaks of it is about in 1803, and then mainly from 1827 that he actually talks of it again and again. So this is the beginning of the 19th century and the very last 2 decades of Goethe's life, actually. So by this time, he is a very, very established author, and some of the other facts of the world are that European colonialism as at its peak, particularly the British and French colonialism, and Germany is also a very, very emerging power. There has been, in the name of international exchanges in literature, there has been already some awareness of the ancient Indian literatures, Chinese literature, Persian, and others, and of course also Greek and Latin literature. So there is, we know, in the world, there is a very high rate of mobility in comparison with the centuries before that, not in comparison with today's world. So this mobility and this emergence of the international world, which is also essentially the colonial world, there is this, and the printing industry, there is this spread of printed literature. Goethe and the rest of the people henceforth have thought of world literature essentially as printed, authored, modern literature, which also is at times called European bourgeois literature, European modern literature. Goethe's own works, of course, Faust, for example, is part of the world literature today, and it includes all works of authored printed literature that have, what they have in common is that they are significant to the world readership, right? So, which means that they are known beyond their local context. So they were written in German, they are known beyond Germany, in English beyond England. And so they are known beyond those cultural and linguistic contexts in which they were created. And not only are they known in other contexts, they have been read and understood so much that they have gained meaning for other readers as well, not only their compatriots, not only people of their country and language, but other people have also found meaning in their work. So it comprises of world literature, then comprises of literature that is naturally, every work is created in a certain cultural context, but that which has broken those cultural contexts and reached beyond and made sense to people beyond. This necessarily implies that this work has also been translated into several other languages. So this phenomenon, which relates with the printed literature. In the recent decades, there have been questions as to what constitutes world literature, even within authored printed literature. Does it only mean European literature, essentially, and other Western American literatures? It would not be wrong to say that in large measures, yes, there is a certain Eurocentrism which is inherent in this concept. And it does start with and includes major works of European literature. In later decades, in the late 20th century onwards, there has been movement towards including other works of literature, African works of literature, and ancient works of literature, for example. But then again, it is about works of literature that have been authored by somebody and printed at some level. So world literature, Goethe was proposing at a time, and his hope was that with the increase in communication, literature of each countries will increase an awareness, and that in itself will somehow sabotage this national cultural boundaries and create this international world universal community of readers and a sharing of ideas and spread of ideas. So literature was in that sense not only a very typical cultural product, but also something which creates this international dialogue around themes and is based on those themes also. So local is very particular, where local is very universal, and universal is very particular and local. Right, so this concept has been related more with printed literature. There has been some criticism of this, as I have said, and that has been expanded. But more recently, very recently, in just 5-6 years ago, that we also were in a group where we were discussing as to what is the position of oral literatures, or folklore as it may be popularly called. What is the basic idea being orality? And when we start thinking of orality, now this concept, orature, developed by a Ugandan linguist, Pio Zirimu, in 1970s, related to African literature, African oral literatures, but naturally it has expanded way beyond that. And so how does it differ from folklore, let us say, or how does it differ from oral literature when we use the term? It differs in two ways. That if you say oral literature, you kind of subordinate it to the idea of literature. If you say folklore, you kind of, it's a very European concept and means very everyday, day-to-day small stories and songs and things. But if you look around the world, and as some other scholars, African scholars and some other scholars have pointed out, that the large part of the world actually has orality as literary communication, right? So if oral literature is not a term subordinated to literature. There are authors who have questioned, what is the meaning of literature? Does literature, the way we think of literature today, it's like, in brackets before literature is printed literature, written literature, like literature has become the preserve of printed and written literature. But no, the word literature itself has something to do with literariness, with storytelling, with creative constructions, and therefore also they have challenged this oral literature as to, just being subordinated. And orature has come up to mean actually orality in more serious expression. So across the world, whether it's the continent of Africa or Asia or Latin America, oral creative expressions, texts, which being oral, still maintain the structural integrity over time and space. So over hundreds of years, the texts are narrated and they maintain the structure of the text, the construction of sentences, or the construction of the poetic verse is maintained verbatim by oral narration, entrusted to memory. So it is now these texts, for example, they are very stylized texts. Their narration is very stylized. Their narration needs to be learned. Their narration needs to be then performed in that sense. And therefore, the stability of these texts matches, for example, the stability of literary texts. If you say that the oral texts are not stable and therefore not literature, but no, very many oral texts are oral epics that are stable and entrusted to memory, their structure, and that they continue. At another level, if we say that world literature is something which has spread beyond its cultural boundaries, and therefore it deserves to be called world literature. Now let us look at some very identified, not single, but sets of stories that have traversed the world for very long. Think of Panchtantra, for example. Way before the beginning of the Christian era, Panchtantra, via translations into Arabic, had reached ancient Greek and had been spreading and continues to spread. The same can be said of Jataka stories. The very same can be said of several others at other points of times of 1001 Arabian Nights, for example. The way it has spread in Asia and beyond Asia for a very long time. Now, these texts were also traveling. They were being translated and they were being adapted, and they are being so they are spreading the word. They are spreading genres. The very genre of fable comes from Panchtantra and spreads to the whole world literature as a genre. So they are spreading genres. They are spreading narratives. They are spreading content. They are spreading ideas, and etc. And this has been in circulation for such a long time that several of these are already called or can be called transnational, transcultural texts. So such texts, for example, deserve to be identified under the concept of orature. I have myself used the term orature in a recent research and publication in connection with those oral texts and their performance which are connected to a written text, right? So this written text may be totally fictional, in the sense that the narrators, oral narrators, tell you that there was a text that their ancestors had for 500 years ago, but in which process that text was forgotten or lost. Not forgotten, but the text was lost and entrusted to memory, it continues. There are texts which are connected to very established texts. For example, in Himalayas, Pandwani, the oral version of Mahabharata. And actually, it is very deeply connected to a very well-established epic. Yet it is its own narrative, yet it's its own style, it is its own language, and therefore its own meaning that it creates in its performance and in its life. And therefore, this is a matter of orature. And this, for example, again, in its spread, in its linkages, is something which has traversed cultural linguistic boundaries. Hardly needs an introduction to that subject. It's travel across the world. In more modern times, since the beginning of the 19th century, when we look at collections of folklore, we see that the Brothers Grimm, for example, beginning of 19th century, and the collection of German folk tales that immediately became very, very popular in Germany and very soon across Europe and traveled across the world, and is today actually the book which is just next second to Bible in its circulation across the world even now. And with that, the whole idea of the German folk tale and the way it spread across the world, the identity of German folk tale led to the identity of German culture, and which played a very important role later in that century in the making of the German nation, which was not yet a nation when the folktale collection emerged, but showed how different principalities and German-speaking people, how their narratives, their stories were similar, giving birth to the idea of cultural nation, or culture nation. In German, it would be Kulturnation, and a literal translation would be culture nation. So nation which exists before nations are made. And naturally, this idea has been used at other times of history in very different contexts. But at the time of Brothers Grimm, this idea is towards making of a nation and applied and seen very, very successfully. At another level, the very idea of folklore and as something collectible, retellable, into printed literature runs across the world and is adapted all across the world and into collections, translations, publications, and becomes one of the most stable areas of the publishing industry. And it's pretty, dependable sale as far as the collection of the of folklore go, not necessarily of their analytical works, but as far as so it's a huge industry, and we know that industry exists all around us in many different ways. So again, if you see the orality, the transition that it makes into the world of publishing, and therefore also the way it impacts modern literature, starting from the German literature, the works of Brother Grimm impacts a generation of authors. And similarly, right until today, when we think of magical realism, Salman Rushdie, Günter Grass, Garcia Marquez, when we think of these authors, we again cannot actually understand their genre, their style, without understanding the folk narrative of different cultures. But this magical, this wondrous world, which is its own language, that we cannot understand. So again, the oral literatures have called them oratures, called them folklore. They have hardly remained limited to a time. they have been traveling all across, in fact, preceding modern literatures. And I think that this whole understanding of modern literatures only as printed literature, I doubt even if the creator of this concept had that in mind. And, I'm currently teaching Goethe's and one of the biggest works of world literature, Faust, which is a story. Essentially, he picks up a German oral legend that had been popular since the 16th century and in late 18th century to the first 3 decades of the 19th century. He transforms that legend into a work of world literature, basing it on such universal values as the human being's search for knowledge and what search for knowledge is. And this is a subject which exists across the world, across cultures, across languages. What is knowledge? What is search for knowledge? In all cultures it exists. And but this master storyteller also picked up from an oral legend. And Goethe is an author who transformed several German oral ballads into his works of literature, writing his own versions of them. So naturally, I doubt if an author like that, when he thought of the concept of world literature, whether meant it as narrowly as printed literature. And therefore, I think this concept, which continues to be discussed, has opened up through various academic discourses to understanding of world orature. Otherwise, we leave out more than half the world. If we look at Africa, for example, and its established narratives, long narratives, and its performers. So now, today we see literature getting connected to performance or also being studied through its visual representation. Oral world orators have always had existence at multimedia levels. They have been written, they have been narrated, they have been performed, they have been sung, they have been, danced to, they have been. So in all media, including new media, orators continue to transform themselves, and therefore the understanding of orators towards understanding of cultures, and a concept like world literature in relation with world orators actually becomes way wider and way bigger. And now I would like to connect my concern with ecological consciousness. Now, I'm not talking of environmental laws or reflection of environmental concerns in literature. I'm talking of ecological consciousness, that is consciousness of our habitat, consciousness of our planet, and of other more than human world or the non-human animals. And this whole world, its consciousness and one's own interlinkages or connectivity or placement with us. How do we see ourselves consciously or unconsciously? We see ourselves, and how is that consciousness constructed? Now, this is not the time, actually, in terms of the amount of time that one has here, for me to go into the details of how consciousness is created and the role of storytelling in the creation of consciousness. But I think we all understand that the role of storytelling in the creation of consciousness can hardly be overestimated. It is there. It is in every possible way. But what is the stories that we actually hear? And now if you go across the world from the so-called, the world of the indigenous people to the most cosmopolitan world, stories get across to children as first form of communication. Be they read, be they coming up through the internet or through podcasts or whatever, but stories is that which is the medium of education, of learning, of becoming aware at all, of becoming conscious. So if we understand the role of storytelling so well into the making of modern consciousness, then I think it is only a matter of giving thought to this, that what has our consciousness been made of for the longest period of time? For the longest period of time, what has made our consciousness, and consciousness is genetic, mimetic, it goes through, it then will go back to the oldest of stories that have been available to us. And that we know of had been there 500-600 years before BC. So therefore, if we go and we see, for example, the stories of Panchtantra as current as they are old. So now if you see this, so what you see is in any culture that in German, let's say, the German stories predate the Christian history of Germany in many ways. And therefore, this cultural consciousness, this consciousness that goes back to storytelling, to oldest of storytellings. And some scholars have also said that folklore is actually the cultural DNA of any civilization, of any culture. So if we now try to study ecological consciousness as it is in this story. So once again, not the time and place to go into details, but I'll just point out 2 or 3 examples to show how the world orature, not only Indian folklore or Indian world orature, is located in its ecology, in its natural surroundings, be it Latin American indigenous people of South America's, indigenous peoples of North America's, African people, South Asians. All orators are Icelandic, Antarctic. All orators are essentially located in their ecology. And therefore, they carry an ecological consciousness of which sometimes even the narrators and tellers may become unconscious, but they carry that ecological consciousness of their regions. And therefore, through our world ecological consciousness, our planetary ecological consciousness, if it exists anywhere, it exists so dispersed in the world orature. And our study of that, my study is of very small fragments of Indian orature, of European orature, of German orature, to an extent of Latin American, but very, very limited study. And yet I feel more as I hear to scholars, and I must say I consider myself fortunate to be able to listen to scholars from very many different contexts. I realize that this ecological consciousness, this kind of an international study of world orature, can only be naturally a collaborative study of scholars from all across. But we can probably try and reach what is an ecological consciousness across the world. And we all know how required that is in the world that we are living with, in the ecological travesty which is all around us, and an environment and a planet which is much in need of healing. How important it is to see to it how we could contribute as scholars of world literature, world orature, towards a better ecological consciousness in our times. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions if there are any later. Thank you.
Madam, should we take the questions at the end or now?
As you wish. That's totally up to you.
Is there any question? Is there any queries? And it's such a wonderful talk on folklore. Actually, folklore literature, we actually think that folklore literature has a very limited boundary, but it has not. It doesn't have a limited boundary. It can very well connect itself with other ranges of literature. So we are so happy to know that. Thank you so much. So we are moving to our next speaker, Professor Simi Malhotra. She is a professor in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia University. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome to the session. I welcome you to present your talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, for that introduction. And of course, I'm most thankful to my dear friend, but I mean the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindu University, Professor Nandini Sahu, for this invitation. I don't really need to speak a lot about, and she knows how much I admire her, not just for the scholarship she brings, but also the vision and the leadership that she gives to the university. And I'm sure with all the MA programs and the vision that she has for folklore and for tribal literatures and other language programs, the university will certainly go on to flourish. And of course, I'm most grateful to Professor Sahu also for giving me the opportunity to be on the same panel as with Professor and Sadhana Naithani. I mean, I've been such a huge fan of her and her work and her scholarship for such a long time. I mean, I haven't really got an opportunity over the years to say this, but I mean, all our students owe so much of the research that they do to your work, Professor Naithani, and so it's such an honor to be part of the same panel. I'm going to share my PPT. So if you'll just give me a second, I'll just share my PPT. You can let me know if it's visible.
Yes, Simi, it's visible.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So, right. So, as probably it's visible on the screen that I'll be speaking. I mean, of course, I must admit by saying that I'm really not a scholar of world literature or comparative world literature, but I did think that if I have something to contribute to this series, then I must speak on the topic. And so I thought that I would talk to you a little bit about what Ngugi wa Thiong'o has to say on world literature. I mean, I'm sure I don't really need to introduce Ngugi wa Thiong'o to an audience which is as rich as this, but I mean, just as a way of orienting ourselves. He's, of course, a Kenyan writer. Of course, he's known very well for his novels, for his plays, and of course for some of the works which are part of most syllabus and curricula all across India and the world, which is his famous, prose works like Decolonizing the Mind, and also, of course, many other things that he's written about. But I thought that for today, I will talk about something which is a little relatively lesser known about what Ngugi wa Thiong'o also talks about, which is what I thought I will talk to you all about. Of course, he's also a children's writer, which often doesn't get talked about. But he also gave a series of lectures as part of the René Belloc Library Lecture Series, where he gave a series of 4 lectures, which subsequently, and this was in 2010, and which was subsequently published in a book which was published in 2012. You can tell me if the screen has shifted, which was published as this book called Globalectics, Theory and the Politics of Knowing, which was published from Columbia University Press in 2012. I hope you can see the change screen. Can you see the change screen?
No, we are still, yeah, now it has moved.
All right. Yeah. So, yeah, sometimes there's a problem. So, yeah. Right. So, yeah. So, right. So I will, so I will talk to you about this particular work of his, which is, like I said, that it was a lecture series which he had given on critical theory in 2010, and which was subsequently published in 2012 as Globalectics, Theory and the Politics of Knowing. And there are 3 large, categories that he deals with, and I won't really spend a lot of time on poor theory. I will spend some bit of time on cyberality, but largely I will talk to you about what his idea of the globalectical vision is, which informs, how he looks at the category of world literature. So I'll begin with the first lecture which he had given, which of course is something which gets reflected in the introduction to the work, and which is titled as Riches of Poor Theory. Of course, those of you who would know, I mean, there's of course a certain kind of resonance here of not just not just Proudhon and not just of Poor Theatre by Grotowski, etc. But there is a point that he wishes to make about the riches of poor theory. I'm not going to read all the quotes, but I will have something to say about what he has to say about poor theory. And I think that's an interesting thing, especially since poor is no longer a very popular or even a very fashionable term, and yet he brings in the idea of the poor in some senses, and I thought that was fairly interesting. And of course, this is his idea of the poor theory in some ways is also a severe indictment of a certain received tradition of theory, of literary and cultural theory, and he's offering an indictment. If you look at and I'm hoping that my slide has shifted. It has, right?
Yes. No, it hasn't. It hasn't shifted.
Okay.
It's still in the riches of the poor.
Can you now see the slide? I'm so sorry. My PPT has been giving me trouble. That's why I'm having to ask. Can you now see the slide?
We are at the second one after the cover page.
Right. All right. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Really, I'm so sorry for. Yeah. Right. So yeah. So I will talk a little bit about what he has to say about poor theory, and what he does go on to say about poor theory is, like I said, that it is a severe indictment of the received tradition of theory, where he says, and if you look at the first quote, he says, poor
Hello, Simi ma'am.
a kind of modern scholasticism. And of course, he goes on to say further, he says, poor theory may simply remind us that density of words is not the same thing as the complexity of thought, that such density sometimes can obscure clarity of thought. So, of course, like I said, that he's offering a certain kind of an indictment of received tradition of literary and cultural theory. And of course, he's critical of a certain kind of a complexity in words, which does not really necessarily translate in terms of complexity of ideas and thought in some senses. He also defines poor theory, if you look at the second quote, not to romanticize the idea of poor, but he says that poor by its circumstances has to be forced into becoming creative and experimental in order to survive. So if you look at what he says even in social life, poor means being extremely creative and experimental in order to survive. The homeless try to make a home anyway, even in places that do not suggest a home. And so, of course, he goes on to define that how circumstances primarily forces one, and necessity almost drives one to yoke, this creative and experimental energy in order to survive. So the idea is not to romanticize the idea of poor, but poor is something which need not be poor in terms of creativity or in terms of experimentation. And then, of course, the third point that he goes on to make, which is also very important, where he says, where he almost embodies the idea of theory by saying that some of the poor actually carry theory on their bodies. And I mean, I'm not going to touch upon this right now, but I will come to the notion of poor theory in a while. But I'll quickly move on to what he is talking about in terms of his globalectical vision, which is what this idea or his views about world literature also kind of emerge from. And so in the introduction itself, he goes on to talk about his idea of globalectics. And he says, if you look at the last quote, he says, globalectics is derived from the shape of the globe. On its surface, there is no one center. Any point is equally a center. As for the internal center of the globe, all points on the surface are equidistant to it, like the spokes of a bicycle wheel that meet at the hub. Globalectics combines the global and the dialectical to describe a mutually affecting dialogue or multilogue in the phenomena of nature and nurture in a global space that's rapidly transcending that of the artificially bounded as nation and region. Globalectics embraces wholeness, interconnectedness, equality or potentiality of parts, tension, and motion. It is a way of thinking and relating to the world, particularly in the era of globalism and globalization. So, of course, the portmanteau term that he develops, the idea of globalectics, is part of his vision of a multilogue, which can possibly be the way to look at this reorganization of the globe, where nature and nurture and interconnectedness and a wholeness can probably achieve his globalectical vision. And this is what he largely expounds in the rest of his lecture series and his book in some senses. So I'll move to the next slide. And the next slide is basically a continuity of what he talks about. So I'm hoping that we've come to the next slide, which is called. So this is the third lecture which he had given, which is called, which is the chapter third in this book, which is called Globalectical Imagination: The World in the Post-Colonial. I'm hoping that the slide is visible. Is it?
Yes, it is visible.
Right, thank you. So of course, his globalectical imagination goes on to locate the idea of world or the idea of world literature in the vortex of the post-colonial, and this is a very interesting argument that he seems to be making. And of course, when one talks about, and after Professor Naithani has already spoken about Goethe, in any case, I don't really need to go back to it. But I mean, of course, he starts off by talking about Goethe. And if you look at the first quote, he goes on to talk about Goethe and what Goethe says about national literature. And he quotes and he says, national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. And he also quotes Marx and Engels, the other people who also talk a lot about world literature, where he says that the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property, national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local cultures, there arises a world literature. So, of course, paying homage to Goethean and Marxian and Engelsian kind of an idea of world literature, he does, bring himself to the idea of world literature in itself. I must, of course, say that for those of you who obviously know about Gugi wa Thiong'o, Gugi wa Thiong'o did abrogate his Christian name of James Gugi and went back to, of course, his native name, just as he abrogated writing in English and he went back to Gikuyu. And it's very interesting that for somebody who had emerged from a certain, and of course, we know about his past and his family being involved with the Mau Mau revolution and the price that he had to pay himself. In some senses, he had to, of course, live in exile. He still lives in exile, but being incarcerated and things like that. And so, nation, of course, was a, and of course, often we think of him as a national hero from Kenya in some senses. But it is very interesting what he has to say when he embraces the idea of world literature and what he has to say about world literature, and which is very different from the kind of position that he probably would have advocated right at the beginning of his writing career. And so, if you look at the third quote, he says, at present, the post-colonial is the closest to the Goethean and Marxian conception of world literature because it is a product of different streams and influences from different points of the globe, a diversity of sources which it reflects in turn. The post-colonial is inherently outward-looking, inherently international in its very constitution in terms of themes, language, and the intellectual formation of the writers. It would be quite productive to look at world literature, though not exclusively, through post-coloniality. Now, this is, of course, very interesting what he goes on to say, that so even the Goethe and Marx may not have necessarily directly talked about world literature in terms of not just rooted in Europe, but in the post-colony in some senses. But for Ngugi wa Thiong'o, of course, being from Kenya, he locates the idea of world literature, and he says that the category which probably comes closest to and closely reflects the concerns of world literature is the post-colonial itself. And so he locates the idea of world literature within the post-colonial. And what is, of course, very interesting is what he has to also say about the post-colony. He does not locate the post-colony necessarily in the erstwhile colonized, global South in some senses, but he says that the post-colony, that the whole world is the post-colony in some senses. It is the erstwhile colonial powers or the erstwhile global North, which is also the post-colony. So post-colony is not something which is only the third world, as he uses within quotes. So if you look at the last quote, he goes on to say, in reality, the post-colonial is not simply located in the third world. Literally rooted in the intertextuality of products from all corners of the globe, its universalist tendency is inherent in its very relationship to historical colonialism and its globe for a theatre. The post-colonial is at the heart of the constitution of Goethe's world literature, and even in theory, it indeed constitutes the non-imperial heart of the modern and postmodern. So, of course, for him, the reason why post-colonial becomes the best lens in some senses to locate the idea of world literature or to look at the idea of world literature from is primarily because the post-colonial carries the impulse of the non-imperial, which is not what one can say probably of the early conception of world literature, which primarily had its own Eurocentric kind of biases in some senses. So therefore, he goes on to say that the post-colonial is probably what was at heart of this idea of world literature in itself. And to carry on this discussion, I'll go on to my next slide. And what he goes on to say, of course, is even more interesting in this lecture which he gave and which he spoke about. So in the next slide, if you look at the first quote, he goes on to say, in such a world of shared intellectual property, organizing the teaching of literature on the principle of national boundaries is outmoded, and even more so, the export of national literatures is a superior knowledge. Goethe advised fellow Germans to look beyond the narrow circle that surrounds us. He liked to look about himself in foreign nations, and he advised everyone to do the same. Goethe and Marx did not see or mean that any one national literature would constitute world literature. World literature would be like the sea or the ocean into which all streams from all corners of the globe would flow. So, of course, the idea, of course, of world literature is precisely premised on something which is able to export itself beyond the idea of the nation or the region or the local in some senses. But he's also cautious in saying that unlike, let's say, for example, a lot of post-colonial discourse, which goes on to valorize its own national cultures or literatures as probably superior to others in some senses, if one has to really inhabit the idea of world literature from a post-colonial lens, one has to have the non-imperial idea also when one looks at one's own national literature and one's own national culture in some senses. And so, of course, he goes on to say that the pedagogic orientation or the reorientation that one needs to have when one talks about the reading or teaching of literature, one has to obviously embrace this idea of going beyond a national idea of a national idea as the fulcrum through which one can probably talk about the post-colonial. And what he goes on to say next is, he says, and if you look at the second quote, he says, the result is the vastness of the sea and the ocean. Confronted with the possibility of that reality, and quite frankly, its vastness, it is easy for organizers of literary knowledge to stop in fright and stay within a national boundary, taking comfort in the certainty of the structures already tried and passed on as tradition. The traditional organization of literature along national boundaries is like bathing in a river instead of sailing in the ocean, or trying to contain a river's flow within a specific territory. So, of course, he's also very, very clear on this issue of those who are gatekeepers of literary knowledge or literary culture are bound to take comfort in probably certainty of structures, and probably would embrace the idea of national boundaries as a given boundary, which, and of course, in the name of civilization, tradition, etc., the post-colonial probably would support this kind of an idea. But he's very critical of this national one-sidedness, this parochialism, which is something that he's fairly critical of, and which will be probably even more clear from the next quote that I have for you, where he says, works of imagination are amazingly anti-national, even where the author may think she or he is espousing national themes. People identify with a good tale and the characters, irrespective of the tale's region of origins. Like a mirror or a camera, a work of art may reveal more than consciously intended. Works of imagination refuse to be bound within national geographies. They leap out of nationalist prisons and find welcoming fans outside the geographic walls. But they can also encounter others who want to put them back within the walls as if they were criminals on the loose. Equally important, if not more so, are approaches to the text, how we read it. Do we want to welcome it, or do we want to be put back into a prison, or even a new prison? So, of course, as you can make out from this quote, even if it is a local tale or a regional tale or a national tale, so to say, it is by definition, if it is a good tale with good characters, it is by definition, according to Googie, anti-national, because it will find welcoming fans outside its national boundary in some senses. And of course, he goes on to say that there will be tendencies within literature and organization of literature to probably put them back into prisons. But it is for us as readers to decide, do we want to be imprisoned by a text, or do we want to be freed by a text? And so, of course, he links the idea of world literature to the idea of freedom in some senses. And so his idea of global ethical vision is not just a corpus in some senses in what he's defining world literature to be, but it is also a way of reading. It is also a vision in terms of what is the epistemology, or what is the mode through which we approach texts in some senses. And so if you look at the last quote, he says, the question arises, do we want to free and to be freed by the text? It depends on how we read it and what baggage we bring to it. To release the worldliness in all its multifaceted character, it's perhaps better to read literature, any literature, through a global ethic vision. So, of course, his idea is that if one has to embrace the idea of a worldly vision, then one has to necessarily embrace the idea of a global ethical vision, where it necessarily dislocates us from one's own heuristic location of time and space and takes one to another time, to another place, to another world, to another story. And that is precisely what the idea of a global ethical vision is, which unhinges you from your own national boundedness in some senses. And that is precisely how his vision of a world literature or a post-colonial non-imperial idea of a global ethical vision is. And I'll quickly go on to the last part of what he goes on to say, which is that I've moved to the next slide, and I'm continuing with this third chapter, which is global ethical vision, the world in the post-colonial. He of course goes on to, while talking about that, what his vision of a global ethical reading would be. He goes on to say that one of the obstacles, and I won't read this long quote because it is a rather long quote, but what he goes on to say is that one of the obstacles to a global ethic reading is the tendency to look at literature and the languages of its birth in terms of hierarchy. The notion that some languages and cultures are inherently of a higher order than others. This is the current relationship between languages, what elsewhere I've called linguistic feudalism, with an aristocracy of languages at the top and the menial barbaric languages at the bottom. And of course, he gives a whole list of languages of this hierarchy of European languages and languages from the global south, etc., etc. And of course, he goes on to say that literature and culture tend to be valued according to what position their language of composition occupies in the hierarchy. And then, of course, he goes on to say that I've argued for a collapsing of this hierarchy so as to view the relationship between languages, cultures, and literatures in terms of a network, akin but not identical to Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome. In a network, there is no one center. All are points balanced and related to one another by the principle of giving and receiving. The pedagogical organization of literature should reflect that sense of a common the pedagogical organization of literature should reflect that sense of a common heritage of simultaneously taking and giving assumed by a network. And of course, he goes on to add something more, where he says, central to the pedagogical enterprise is the practice of translation. Translation is the language of languages. It opens the gates of national and linguistic prisons. It is thus one of the most important allies of world literature and global consciousness. So, of course, what he goes on to say is that even though he's talking about the idea of a globalistic reading, a globalistic vision of reading literature and languages, he's obviously aware of the fact that there is linguistic feudalism. There are certain languages which are preferred over the others, but he's making a case for breaking this hierarchy by talking about the fact that we need to think of languages more in terms of a network and more in terms of Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the rhizome in some senses. And of course, what he goes on to say is that for such an enterprise primarily to work, the ally that we need for truly there for there to be a true reflection of world literature which can reflect the post-colonial is of course the pedagogical enterprise of translation itself. And of course, therefore he goes on to say that translation is the language of languages. And of course he says that it opens the gates of national and linguistic prisons. So for him, world literature has its greatest ally in translation, and translation therefore becomes the mode through which one can probably get rid of this linguistic feudalism. Moving on, of course, he goes on to say that globalectics, therefore, for him becomes a way of reading world literature. He says, globalectical reading means breaking open the prison house of imagination built by theories and outlook that would seem to signify the content within is classified, open to only a few. This involves declassifying theory in the sense of making it accessible, a tool for clarifying interactive connections and interconnections of social phenomena and their mutual impact in the local and global space. Of course, the point that he's trying to make here is, and his idea of declassifying theory is precisely to say that there is a certain kind of a verbosity which has defined a certain creation of this idea of literary and cultural theory. But if globalectics has to open up the prison house of imagination, which is built by certain theories and outlooks and lenses through which we look at literature and culture, and which is only classified and available only to a few, if one has to really declassify it and make it accessible, then one has to necessarily embrace the idea of what I began with, which is the idea of poor theory. And so, of course, he ends this by saying, world literature, of which the post-colonial is an integral part, is our common heritage as much as the air we breathe. So for him, world literature is very, very closely aligned with his vision of this globalectic vision, which goes on to define the whole world as a post-colonial, and post-colonial therefore becomes the lens through which one must approach the idea of world literature. And I'll quickly move on to the last slide that I have. And in some senses, it also ties with what Professor Naithani was talking about in terms of orature. And this is another lecture which he had given as part of the René Bellet Library Lecture Series, and which got published as the 4th chapter in this book on globalectics, which is called The Oral Native and the Writing Master, Orature, Orality, and Cyberality. I hope you can see the last slide. Can someone just confirm? . Can you see
Yes,
the?
it's visible.
Okay, thank you. Right. Yeah. Right. So, of course, so like he had talked about the idea of linguistic feudalism, he also goes on to talk about another kind of feudalism which exists within literature and culture, and which is the idea of aesthetic feudalism. So, of course, what he goes on to say, if you look at the first quote, he says, aesthetic feudalism arising from placing cultures in a hierarchy is best seen in the relationship between oral and written languages, where the oral, even when viewed as being more authentic or closer to the natural, is treated as the bondsman to the writing master. With orality taken as the source for the written and orature as as the raw material for literature, both were certainly placed on a lower rung in the ladder of achievement and civilization. And of course, this is something that we know, which is that the oral or the folk is something which within this aesthetic feudalism, in this hierarchy, often gets treated as a bondsman to the writing master in some senses. But what he goes on to say is, and if you look at the second quote, he says, however, the lines between the written and the orally transmitted are being blurred in the age of internet and cyberspace. This has been going on for some years, with the writing down of the orally transmitted, the electronic transmission of the written as spoken through the radio and television, or simply the radio as a medium of speech. But it has surely accelerated, with all corners of the globe becoming neighborhoods in cyberspace. Through technology, people can speak in real time, face to face. The language of texting and emailing and access to everything, including pictures and music in real time, is producing a phenomena that is neither pure speech nor pure writing. The language of cyberspace may borrow the language of orality, Twitter, chat rooms, Twitter, chat rooms. We've been talking when they mean we've been texting, or chatting through writing emails, but it is orality mediated by writing. It is neither one nor the other. It's both. It's cyberality. And this is, of course, the point that he's trying to make, that while we may have had aesthetic feudalism, where orality would be considered as subordinate to the idea of the written, but as he goes on to say, that currently what we are encountering is neither pure speech nor pure writing, especially in the neighborhood of cyberspace, where in this globe of this neighborhood that we occupy. And of course, he goes on to say that the language that is being produced now in cyberspace is something which borrows heavily from the language of orality, whether it's Twitter or chatting or, etc., etc. And of course, what he goes on to say is that orality is mediating writing. And so therefore, what we're encountering in terms of language is neither orality nor writing, but it is both in some senses. And this is what he constitutes as cyberality, which is again a portmanteau term of cyber and orality. And of course, then he ends by producing, asking a rhetorical kind of a question, which he himself answers, of course. And he goes on to ask this question about cyborature. So, of course, there's literature and there's orature, but he's talking about cyborature, which is really a mix of orality and writing in some senses. And he goes on to ask this question, that will this produce cyborature? And of course, he goes on to answer by saying, already we have entered the world of ebooks and audiobooks on CDs, a host of endless possibilities. All we can say is that writing and orality are realizing anew the natural alliance they've always had in reality, despite attempts to make the alliance invisible or antagonistic. I hope that this means that no cultures and communities need be denied history because they had not developed a writing system, that the oral and the written are not and have never been real antagonists. Certainly, the powers of their products, orature and literature, will continually be harnessed to enrich creativity in the age of internet and cyberspace. The problem has not been the fact of the oral or the written, but their placement in a hierarchy. Network, not hierarchy, will free the richness of the aesthetic, oral or literary. So, of course, he goes on to, he has a fairly affirmative view of cyborature. And of course, he goes on to say that this competitive, or this, pitting as into these altercative, universes of writing and orality is something which is not really the relationship. They're not real antagonists in that sense. And of course, he goes on to say that orature and literature can probably be harnessed in this age of creativity, in this age of cyberspace, to actually produce cybernature, and so it's not really the oral or the written which is the problem, but basically the hierarchy. And again, he goes back to the idea of network, which will probably be able to reorient this idea of this aesthetic feudalism, the second problem other than linguistic feudalism that he kind of spoke about. And so what I'll do is that I will wrap up here. But what I wanted to essentially do was to share, Gugi Batyongo, who of course comes from a certain kind of a position which we fairly well know through the initial position that he's had, but in the last decade or so, the kind of views that he's presented to us about world literature, about his global lectical vision of reading, and about cybernature itself is something that I felt would be interesting to share with all of you. So thank you so much for your time and for listening to me. I'll be happy to engage with any questions that there might be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a great insightful talk. Thank you so much. I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, to give some critical remark on the talks.
Okay, thank you, Priyanka. Am I audible?
Yes,
Am I audible?
yes, ma'am.
Okay, these are two very, very substantial brainstorming kind of lectures. And to comment on these kind of lectures, one needs that kind of substance in themselves as well. So when both of them were speaking, I was taking important points which we can use at a later stage as a part of our syllabus and as a part of our research in the university. I must congratulate both the speakers for this very well researched presentations, both of you. Many congratulations to both. About Professor Sadhana's lecture, she talked about world orature and ecological consciousness, and then she referred to European bourgeois, and then world literature beyond linguistics and cultural contexts. And then also she talked about world literature breaking the cultural contexts, importance of translation studies and print material. She questioned world literature vis-a-vis Eurocentrism, the local and the universal ideas in world literary texts, then importance of orality and folklore, that she is a master of folklore. And in fact, both the lectures by Professor Simi and Professor Sadhana, they ended up talking about the hierarchy of the written and the oral. So this is what I'm going to think a lot, that both of them, without any preparation, that both of them are going to talk about this, but they ended up with this. And then Professor Sadhana also pointed out memory studies and travel literature, the Panchatantra, which on her recommendation I have used in MA folk literature, and also we are going to use the Panchatantra in our MA courses in the university. Then this idea of the spreading genres will be something very useful for us when we design so many MA programs. And the transcultural texts in the context of orality, when she pointed out that she talked about Himalayan folklore, Garcia, then Rushdie, Latin American, South Asian, Icelandic orators, environmental laws, and then a very interesting idea Professor Sadhana has given us to create podcasts. I will ask my faculty members to create podcasts on all the lectures that they are attending. They're taking important points, and then we can create some podcasts and use them as a part of our syllabus, as a part of our audio video material for the students. So my takeaway, after I have taken down so many points from Professor Sadhana, my takeaway that I am going to use for our research in Hindi University, a few points I have jotted down. German folklore as transcultural archive. Like we can take text from Cinderella, then Little Red Riding Hood, those kind of texts we can take in our BA or MA courses. And then orality and the evolution of the narrative forms. She hinted at that, like German folk narratives. They are rooted in orality. They highlight how storytelling structures shift when transitioning from spoken to the written forms. She referred to the Grimm's brothers. And then also another idea that I have taken from Professor Sadhana is folklore and the politics of cultural ownership. Who is the owner of some kind of literature when it is oral, when it is passed on from generation to generation? So folklore and the politics of cultural ownership and political ownership. I will think about it and I'll get back to you, Professor Sadhana, if I need more ideas from you. And then in comparative world literature, that you talked about, it interrogates who owns a folk tradition. And then also another idea that I have taken from you is transculturalism and the global adaptation of German folk tales. You gave such interesting ideas about German folk tales, then how seamlessly we can take those to Indian folk tales and make a comparative pedagogy there. I have taken that idea from your lecture as well. And then folklore as a medium of resistance and reinvention. Your concluding remarks were somewhat hinting at that. While folklore presents or preserves cultural memory, it also serves as a tool for resistance and reinvention. And the reinvention of what? What kind of comparative pedagogy we are creating by working on orality and written literatures together worldwide? German folklore, Indian folklore, then also you hinted at Icelandic literature, South so all these things, it was a very, very important and a brainstorming session. So many ideas I have taken. I'm going to have a thorough discussion with you when we design our MA folk literature here as well, because IGNO was open and distance learning. We designed the material, we wrote the material and then printed, but here it will be classroom teaching. It's a conventional university, so the teachers need thorough training and important sessions like this before they get into the classroom to teach folklore. Otherwise they will end up maybe making it very simplistic, which is the biggest challenge in these kind of places where classroom teaching can be simplistic if they are not reading a lot of discourses or listening to people like you and Professor Simi, and making it theory oriented. And when it is theory, one will definitely talk about Professor Simi. I was also taking notes when Professor Simi was speaking. Gugi Huaqiong's Global Ethics and the Theory and the Politics of Knowing. It's very interesting. I have read it, but I recommend that the faculty members also read the text and get in touch with Professor Simi. She has authority over these kind of texts. And then literary and cultural theory is her forte. Intertextuality and historical colonialization, something she talked about. And then I am very keen to read more about to be free of a text. It's a novel idea for me. How to be free of a text when you are reading so much of a text. I will read more about it. And then translation in nationalism and world literature pedagogy is something that Professor Simi talked about. And global ethics as declassifying theory and breaking the boundaries of the mind, and again declassifying the mind. Such an important idea and so critical it is unless one uses a lot of thinking and a lot of pondering over such ideas. So from Professor Simi, I have taken a few things which we will use as the block one. Yes, Professor Simi, I will take this text in MA folk literature definitely. And then Gugiwa Thong's concept of world literature, when you talked for a few points that I am taking as a part of the syllabuses, global ethics as a decolonial framework from world literature. That's what you talked a lot. And then decolonizing language and world literature. So initially you talked about the concept, then you came to language, how the critique argues that language is central to literary hegemony. And then third concept or idea that I have taken from your lecture is world literature and the politics of knowledge production. And the politics of knowing, it challenges the global literary market's preferences for African writers who write in English or French. Then the next idea that I have taken from your lecture is orality, memory, and the global circulation of the stories, and how the critique shows the oral traditions of Africa, Asia, and the indigenous cultures that challenge the Eurocentric notion that only written literature qualifies as world literature. Both of you have given so much of importance to oral literature. As a folklorist myself, working on folk literature for say past 15, 20 years, I'm extremely happy and satisfied that even your kind of scholars are giving equal weightage to written literature and oral literature, and the food for thought for the faculty and the students today, including me, would be the hierarchy of written and the oral. Who comes above whom? So with this, I will stop here, and Dr. Priyanka, you can take a few questions if there are any, or maybe Professor Sadhana and Simi can ask questions to each other, which would be interesting for us.
Is there anybody? can ask a question, or is there any query, is there any question or any comment?
I would like to tell both of them that only 6 to 7 people have joined as panelists here so that we avoid any disturbance, but others have joined as participants in another channel and we are recording everything. Right.
I don't think
If I may, I would say thanks very much to Nandini. I will be continue addressing you as such, Nandini. That thank you very much for your very detailed comments. Right after the lectures, it's something, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with you and also with Simi. And I don't think I have any questions right now I want to get in that. But yes, I must say that I'm very happy to listen to you, Simi, and get connected with some of your thoughts currently. And thank you, Nandini, for providing this opportunity to all of us. You are not in Delhi, and yet you are creating a space where we can talk. And I hope we can continue this discussion in person. And as you say, that you are also going to link it and take it to actually designing of courses. I mean, I'm sure I am very thankful, and I'm sure Simi too, that you are talking of taking it to that level further. And I can only say that I'm very happy and open for any further discussions and whatever help I may be in these wonderful endeavors that you're planning. And I wish you and your colleagues all the best at Hindi University to be able to establish its futuristic courses, so to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sadhana. Nowhere in the world there is a department called comparative world literatures. There are departments of comparative literature, but we are bigger strategists. So we designed something comparative world literature so that we can take Indian languages and foreign languages, where we can create, some kind of parallel and critical pedagogy.
Right. I would also echo what Professor Sadhana Naithani said. Professor Sahu, thank you so much for all your kind remarks, and of course, for leading the university and thinking of actually, I mean, as Professor Naithani said, of taking these lecture series as part of material for the formation of the courses that you're planning to do. So more power to you and to your work that you're doing. I mean, indeed, Hindi University is lucky to have you, and your vision will, I'm sure, take the university from strength to strength. And again, Professor Sahu, thank you for the opportunity of bringing me so close to, I mean, as Professor Naithani said that you're in Calcutta, but you brought us Delhi Walas closer in some senses. But thank you for giving me the opportunity of listening to Professor Naithani. I mean, such a fan of her work, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you to all your colleagues, especially Dr. Basu, and to everybody there at Hindi University. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Priyanka, maybe the vote of thanks.
Thank you
If
so
there are no
much.
questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So we are just at the concluding session. I express my sincere thanks to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, for organizing such wide-ranged lecture series. I express my heartfelt thanks to the speakers who, in spite of being very busy, spared some time to share their insightful thoughts with us. Thank you so much, ma'am. I express my thanks to Echo Sir, Controller Sir, and Registrar Sir, as well as Rajji, for extending all possible help to make this webinar successful. And last but not the least, I express my thanks to all the faculties of Hindi University and students of Hindi University who are present to listen to such great talks. Thanks to all. Thank you so much.
Yeah.